Hey, welcome to the Knitpicks podcast. This is Lee. I'm the books and patterns graphic designer for Knitpicks, and as usual, I'm here with my friend Stacey.
Hi, I'm Stacey Winklepleck. I am the outreach director for Knitpicks, but that just means I work on the cable book, all the books, and cable books. It's been a long couple of days. How are you doing, Lee?
I'm okay. Yeah, as you say, it's been quite a week. We haven't seen each other in person in a while because we've been frozen in our homes, unable to drive anywhere or go outside our front doors.
Yeah, that too. Well, we had a kind of opposite schedule, but yeah, I guess I haven't seen you for a couple of weeks. So, yeah, it's very cold. I'm very glad I'm a sock knitter because I'm wearing like multiple pairs of socks. Literally, I have like 2 pairs of socks on right now, and I kind of have been putting more on just because it's been very, very cold.
Yeah. Thankful for wool. I've been wearing wool on my feet, my head, my body.
Oh yeah, I think I've had a wool hat on for the past week and a half. So, it's hopefully by the time this podcast is released, we will be in warmer, at least slightly warmer temperatures. But we are in the middle of winter, so probably not. So.
Yeah, and we're here in the Pacific Northwest. We know a lot of the country is in very similar situations right now. So hopefully all of you listening are doing better now too, wherever you might be.
So have you got some knitting done during this locked up in your house?
I finished another sweater. I finished my Hawthorne held double improvised cable yoke sweater, and it turned out
it's gorgeous.
So good. I'm so happy with it. It's not the first time I've like improvised a sweater. Like my ice fire wrap sweater hack was I turned a wrap into a sweater, which I've done the same way before with basically squares or rectangles with drop shoulders, but this is the first time I've improvised not a drop shoulder construction, like a yoke construction. So I wasn't sure how it's going to turn out, It was very experimental, and I'm so happy with it. It fits really well. It blocked out.
So pretty.
When I finished it and hadn't blocked it yet and I tried it on, I was like, oh, the neck is kind of tight and the sleeves are kind of short. And I don't know. Not sure. It might not be perfect, but it blocked out perfectly. I stretched it a bit and it grew, and the neck got a bit wider and the sleeves got a bit longer, and it's perfect. Yeah, so this is the one that I started from the bottom up, and the whole body of it is just plain stockinette. So I was just kind of knitting to movies, and once I got to the right length, I did a provisional cast on for the sleeves so that I could do the sleeves last, and joined it all in a big round yoke. And then I started introducing cables kind of like one at a time. So the cables kind of acted like decreases because they started pulling the fabric together. And then I waited until all of the cables had been introduced, and then I did actual decreases at that point. So like the cables kind of worked to start pulling it together, and then the decreases pulled it together further all the way up to the neck. And
it's so pretty.
Thank you. I'm really happy with it. I might put like detailed notes up on my Ravelry project page. Whatever's up, we'll link in the show notes. Just to kind of explain what I did if someone wants to try to copy it. Yeah, nice. I don't know. It made me like really excited to like improvise more sweaters, and I have other ideas going on in my head, and I just want to keep doing that.
More sweaters.
And again, it's Hawthorne held double, which I love so much. I'm really excited about the Hawthorne DK. Another sweater I'm working on right now is that Hawthorne DK one, which I'm also loving, and it's going great. But yeah, Hawthorne held double, like if you have a lot in your stash and you don't want to buy DK for a sweater, Hawthorne held double works excellently for sweaters. It's my second one I've made like that, and it's a really good fabric.
Yeah, I have a Hawthorne, not a Hawthorne DK, Hawthorne held double sweater in my stash, or like not stash, in my kind of not abandoned yet. It's on pause, but it's kind of a same kind of thing where I was kind of improvising. Like I really wanted a big long cardigan with pockets and kind of a mishmash of a bunch of different patterns. And I wanted it in Hawthorne because it was a color that was discontinued called Cully, which is the neighborhood in Portland that I live in. And then the other color that's very similar, which is why it got discontinued, is Springfield, which is where I'm from. It's this town in Oregon. So I'm like, well, I want to knit these together. So I was holding them together since I had both those, like enough
Nice.
for both of them. So I will finish it. I started it like a long time ago, but mainly I've just been like working on my Ventisca vest, which I pronounced like about 15 different ways on this podcast, but and probably all of them are wrong. But anyway, it's from last year's collection, cable collection, and I really love it. It's kind of soothing, even though it's like a cable in every row. But I don't know. I'm just in a rhythm now, so I can do it while we're stuck at home doing meetings from home again, which is what we were doing this week. Because again, very cold. But yeah, so I don't really have anything finished to share because either I'm working on that or I'm working on projects that are not going to be released for a while. So, yep. One spoiler is I have a lot of half sock heels around my desk because I keep trying to get like correct numbers for a sock pattern. And yeah, so there's a bunch of little heels all around my desk. It's very entertaining. So
Something kind of creepy about that. There's a bunch of little
I know.
heels scattered around.
It probably looks a little creepy, but I'm sure other designers know. You guys all know. Like
I've definitely been there.
I don't consider myself a real designer, and I was actually just talking to our tech editor. I'm like, I need to stop like volunteering to write patterns because I don't have as much fun with it. So like, oh, I can do that. That's an easy pattern. I can just do that. No, I need to stop doing that and leave it to the professionals like you and Andy. So
I do have fun with the with the math parts and the figuring things out part, like a puzzle. So I will volunteer.
Yeah. But yeah, so nothing knitting wise new. I've been working on my cross stitch still that I brought up in the last podcast and kind of switching between that and knitting or just honestly just reading while I'm like watching TV or whatever. And yeah, so
Been making more soups and things.
yeah.
Icy foods.
Yeah.
Foods to eat when it's icy.
I was like, not icy foods. That's summer food.
Icy foods.
Yeah, I've been doing that too. We made because this actually the deep freeze that we just got through happened to my partner's birthday. So we were gonna go out, but no. So I made him a big batch of pozole, which is our favorite meal. So and it's very warming.
Nice. I don't think I mentioned this on the podcast, but a couple months ago, I made pozole for the first time, partially inspired by knowing that you love to make it. And I had never made it before. And I had, I grew tomatillos in my garden last summer. And I had like a big fall harvest of like all the last of the tomatillos. And there was a lot. So the main thing I do with them is make salsa. But I had like so many, I was like, okay, I can make salsa, but I still have a lot more. So I made pozole verde with, I don't eat meat, so soy curls for the chicken, which is a good chicken substitute. It was so good. It's one of my favorite soups. It's probably my favorite soup I've made this whole year out of all my soups that I've been making lately. It was really delicious.
Yeah, in the show notes we'll link our. I have a favorite recipe that I use, and I think it's a little bit similar to yours, but we can and we'll just spread pozole. It's so good.
The recipe I used real chicken, but I hacked it to be vegetarian. So I'll put that in the show notes. Yeah, it was so good. Yeah. Yay, soup.
Yeah.
Okay, enough soup talk. We should probably talk about yarn.
Yeah, this is a yarn / knitting podcast. We should probably talk about that and not like soup. So, so we have some stuff on the site that we didn't get a chance to talk to last week. I think the one thing that we all love is Static, the sock yarn Static.
So fun. I designed a hat using Static last year, using an old colorway that's kind of a color blocked, like a 4-quadrant hat, and it worked really well in Static. It was really fun to knit with, to watch it doing its self-striping patterning thing. Super fun.
I remember that. But I think the thing we have the most fun with is picking the color names. So our Static, you've probably figured this out if you looked at any of the Statics. We have like a TV theme. And we've gone last time it was the 70s, so now we're in the 80s TV
Hmm.
shows. So if you look at the names, all of our names are from inspired by TV shows. We don't want to get sued, so they're not the actual name of the TV show.
Yeah.
So we tried to be clever and see if you guys can figure them out. So
And if you open up the descriptions and read the description, it won't be too hard to figure it out. We basically
yeah,
give it away.
Andy wrote
Yeah.
some of my favorite descriptions for these. Andy writes almost all the yarn descriptions, probably all of them actually.
Yeah.
And these were my favorite descriptions she's written. So I remember sending you the unsolved one. That was my absolute favorite one. The lost sock. The mystery of the lost sock. I want to see that on a true crime podcast.
With the red yarn on the bulletin board.
Yeah. Yeah. We got a yarn wall.
It's gotta be red yarn.
But did you have any favorites from the current static? Any favorite colors or names?
Oh man. Oh, I think my favorite's the Max because I grew up watching Saved by the Bell after school every day with my brother. Happy memories of the Max on TV. And it's like a yellow, green, gray kind of colorway that I like a lot. So
Yeah,
it's probably my favorite.
it's really fun. Yeah, on that same note, my favorite is the Cabot Cove. I love the colors anyway, but when I was very young, I was obsessed with Murder, She Wrote, and it was my favorite show. And I think I said this a couple years ago in the office, but when I was like 8 or 9, I wrote my first fan letter, and it was to Angela Lansbury, and it was just because she was Jessica Fletcher, and I wanted to be Jessica Fletcher. So anyway, but besides that, the static yarn is very cool. The great thing we have about these is actually all of them are knit up in a sock, so you can see them.
Mhm.
If you look at the main photo and scroll through them, you'll see them all with the sock right next to the skein yarn, so you can see how the striping works. This is just a plain sock. I think it was just the Go Your Own Way sock pattern that it's my personal pattern, and it's also like my basic sock pattern, so I just use that for whenever I need to get socks knit up. So we've been getting a couple questions about like what sock pattern it is, so it's Go Your Own Way. And we'll link that in the show notes. But yeah, you can see all of the socks all knit up, and they're all so cool. We have a lot of fun
Yeah.
with static. Just the fun colors and fun designs and fun little Fair Isle-ish type stitch patterns and stuff. So yeah.
Ooh, you know what static would look really cool with, I bet? I really want someone to do it so I could see it. Is Andy's pattern, the Joyce cardigan that was
Oh
designed for
yeah.
Pellicini yarn. It's like a color panel intarsia, so it's meant to like take a self-striping yarn and really kind of make the most of it. And the panels are different widths, so the stripes are different widths from each other in each
Hmm.
panel. Anyway, static I think would look really cool in that. Somebody should
Yeah.
make it and comment on the blog post and show us
Yeah.
or tag us on Instagram. I want to
Because
see
you,
it.
why don't you? I bet you
I'm
can
not.
cast on for.
No, I'm not making it. Someone who loves knitting sweaters and fingering weight yarn, which is not me. Although I have thought about trying to hold static double and like start it at the same spot so it's held double so the stripes are the same, yeah, on the two strands.
Oh yeah.
Or maybe holding two different colorways double so like the solids line up and the patterns line up kind of. Anyway, I've played around with this idea in my head, but I haven't actually done it. Maybe
Yeah.
someday.
Awesome. Yeah, we pretty much covered all the new yarns last week, but we also have some other new products on the site. We have these really, really cool project bags. Like
Yeah.
we've been designing some larger project bags. I think it was inspired by our staff members like me, like Andy, like you, who want to carry our sweater projects around, but our current bags don't fit a sweater project.
Yeah, they're great for
So
hats. They're great for socks.
yeah,
Not,
I
not
love
so good for
them.
sweaters. Yeah.
I have so many of them like all over the place,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
but not for sweaters. And sweaters I have
yeah.
to like use like a different bag, or even one that's too big that just it kind of gets lost. But these are like the perfect sweater knitting size.
Hmm.
So we have a couple of them on the site, and we'll definitely link them so you can see them. But my very favorite one is one by Liz Gordon, drawing by Liz Gordon, who is one of our staff members. She works on the crochet side. It's called Sweater Magic, and it is so cute. I wasn't even a part of the conversation when she was showing it, and I just jumped in and like, I know I have nothing to do with this, but that is the cutest drawing I've ever seen. So, yeah, so we've got that on a bag, and it's
She's
just
an
really, really
excellent
cute.
illustrator. Yeah, like outside of work, she does illustration, and I'm gonna link to her Instagram in the show notes so you can check it out.
Yeah,
'Cause her style is so cute.
But yeah, and then it really does fit a sweater. In fact, I carried my Axiom around in this bag for, while I was knitting it, and it was absolutely perfect. So,
Yeah, and that one with the knit group on it, is called the Sweater Project Bag, and that was illustrated by our former coworker Anastasia, who is also an
yeah.
awesome designer and illustrator. Um, Super cute. Love that drawing style. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so cute. I love that one. I really love the Sweater Magic one, and that's the one I have, but I think I might need to get the other one too, just to have like a little backpack type
Mhm.
bag. And then we actually have some really cute colorful ones. Well, just one, but it's the Squirrel Stash project bag, and this is by an illustrator that we'll definitely link in the comments uh in the blog post. But it's the Squirrel Stash project bag, and it's got a happy squirrel and yarn, and it's so, so cute. She also has one on the site called the Alpaca Pals Recycled Cotton Tote Bag, which is also freaking adorable. And I do know that Elena, with her love of alpacas, definitely has this bag. So it's a little bit bigger. So that's like one to carry around. Yeah, it's very, very big.
Yeah, bags of all sizes. And these by the Outside Illustrator by Julia Green, who's in Idaho. So those
Yeah.
were outsourced. Very adorable illustrations. Yeah, I really want that squirrel project bag too. It's so cute.
Yeah. Anyway, so we've got constantly new stuff on the site. We've got more new stuff coming with when this podcast goes up. We'll have a couple new things coming up in about a week or two. So stay tuned to the website and check that new section. All right. Okay. Up next, we are going to do kind of a little bit of a round table. We took some questions from Instagram on cable knitting, and I love doing cable knitting. So we're going to answer some of your burning questions when it comes to cables. So stay tuned.
Hey, and we're back. So in tying in with our collection, which is new in January, and our most recent collection, Homestead Cables, we asked Instagram for our Instagram followers in our stories for questions about cabled sweaters, cable knitting, sweater knitting, cable and or sweater knitting. And we got a bunch of them. So we are super excited to answer your questions. And me, Stacey, and producer Andy, who is a prolific sweater knitter and designer.
Hello.
Yeah, so let's get into it. I'll read the first one. Which cable pullover pattern would be a good beginner one?
Well, I think we all I think it depends on how comfortable you are with sweaters and how comfortable you are with cables. So if you've knit a bunch of like non-cabled sweaters, you might go for a harder one. If you've done a bunch of cables, you might be comfortable picking up like an all-over cable sweater. But I think we all agreed that Axiom is actually one of the best beginner ones. Would you guys agree with me on that?
Yes.
Mhm.
It's a very easy shape, and the cables themselves look more challenging than they are. And we also have a lot of supporting content on the blog that I wrote.
So just in case you don't know, that was the sweater that we did knit along for last fall, winter. So because of the knit along, we did many blog posts, which you can find all on the blog.
And
Yeah.
you can see all of our
tutorials.
lovely pictures of our finished projects. You can see how it looks. Yeah, this is Axiom by Claire Slade, for those who would like to know, we'll link it in the show notes. But I think that's probably the best one. I find that easy because it's just a 6 cable. It's just all over the place. You just keep repeating it over and over again. I find that really easy, but other people might find that challenging. So
The challenging part with an all over cable is not like, especially a short cable repeat, is not actually the cables. It's like the patience,
yeah.
which is what keeps me from doing all over cables all the time. Cables are one of those skills that like looks more complicated than it actually is, especially if it's just vertical panels of cables that don't intersect with each other. So they're definitely worth just like picking a sweater and trying it, because I guarantee it is not as challenging as it looks once you are looking at it one row at a time.
Yeah, totally.
Exactly.
And if it's a pattern, a design that you love and you're really excited to wear it, then you're going to be more likely to have that patience to go through with knitting, even if it's slow because it's all over. I'm going to point out a couple patterns that have like minimal cables only on the sleeves, really. The Harley pullover just has a cable at the sleeves and maybe a little bit of a cable on the bottom. But it's like mostly stockinette. And that's by Jenny Williams. And then the Primrose pullover by Megan Gonzalez is also an all stockinette body, and it has like a pretty complex cable only up the sleeves. So if you are a little bit more experienced with cables, but you just feel overwhelmed with it being all over the entire sweater, then you can do like a more complex cable only on the sleeve, and then the body of it is easier.
Yeah, I was looking at that one too. I was like, should I suggest this one? I think I'm glad you brought it up because it is a really beautiful one. It's just, I think the only complicated part is going to be on that shoulder doing the cable. But I think if you just take the pattern line by line, you'll get through it. I promise.
Yeah. Totally.
All right. We ready to go on the next one, or do you got some more suggestions?
I think we're ready for the next question.
Good.
Okay. When you use cables in a sweater, does that make the sweater tighter when finished? So if it's a good sweater pattern, it should not.
Yeah. So the way the question is worded is a little weird because make the sweater tighter than what? If you're using the exact same stitch count that you use on a plain stockinette sweater, then yes, your sweater will be tighter with cables, but the pattern shouldn't be written that way. The pattern should be written to take account for the cables. So the pattern should have a gauge for usually both stockinette and the cable pattern. And what you want to make sure you're doing is getting gauge.
Oh man, this is going to be like repeated a bunch of times, I think. But it is true. Like it should be, they should like allow for that tight, because cable patterns are going to be tighter than just stockinette. So the designer should allow that in the actual pattern. So it might seem like you're casting on a bunch of more stitches than you feel like it, but the cable is going to draw in. So
you might even be knitting like a ribbed hem and then increase stitches before starting your cable pattern, and those increased stitches account for the cables.
I think Axiom does that, actually. Speaking of Axiom.
Yep. And cables can be used for shaping. Like Lee just finished her sweater where she used the way cables tighten stockinette compared to stockinette to like shape her yoke, which is very clever. So some patterns will do that, but a good pattern will accommodate for it. It'll either use that intentionally for shaping, like Lee's project, or it will have you increase up. Like it shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah. So the key, just to repeat, to do a gauge swatch, and then the important part, especially with cables, to wash your gauge swatch and let it dry the same way that you're going to be letting your sweater dry, which means you're usually not going to like pin it out super hard. If it's a sweater, like, well, it depends. But you want to treat the swatch the same way you're going to be treating your sweater. That way you get an accurate gauge and the right size and the right fit.
And if you're adding a cable to a plain sweater, I kind of threw this in here. If it's something that you really love, this cable that you found, and you just want to put it on like just your basic sweater, you just want to make sure that you are allowing for that different gauges. So I know some people like to do that. So just make sure you're measuring that gauge swatch.
Our next question reads, I have a pattern that has multiple different charts. How do you keep track of what row you are on?
I think there's a bunch of different ways.
Mhm.
Me personally, I use our chart keeper actually, and I print out all of the charts if need be, and like just kind of have them all together so I can see them in order. There's different ways you can do it. If you don't want to do, you can do it on your like on your computer or whatever. I also use a lot of stitch markers, different stitch markers for different patterns. And I use a lot of row counters. I can use two distinct ones. I will use one for what the actual row I'm on of the pattern, and then the other one can be like if it's a sorry, I don't know if I'm making this much clearer, but like if there is a cable pattern with 7 rows and then a cable pattern with like 4 rows, I have two different stitch marker or excuse me, row counters to tell the difference between the two. Or I use one for like how many repeats or whatever. So that's what I do. It sounds complicated, but it works for me.
Yeah, for me, it varies by pattern. Sometimes I'll use like sticky notes, kind of the same as a chart keeper, but just scrappier to like
Yeah.
keep track of. But something I've done in the past is if I'm using multiple charts that have different row counts, then I'll kind of like I'll print it out and make notes like which row the other chart will be on when I'm on this row of the chart. So like write another set of numbers next to
That's a
one
good
of the
idea.
charts to keep track of like, okay, when this chart is on row 8, this other chart's going to be on row 10 or whatever, however it works out to be. So I can kind of know that I'm in the right place.
I read my knitting, so I just look at what the row below looks like compared to the chart, which is not helpful if you don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
What I did before I could do that was I make like chains of stitch markers, locking stitch markers that are the length of the repeat, and I slip my needle every time I reach that marker into the one below with one marker that indicates the first one. And I would put one at the start of each separate panel. So I'd have like, if I had 4 panels, I would have 4 chains of stitch markers, which is a little chaotic, but then I never had to keep notes and then find the notes again.
I used that tip once after you said it like a year ago, and it was super helpful. And I just want to say one real quick that like being able to read your knitting is super important, even if you're not like looking at every row to knit every row by reading your knitting. If you ever like if my sticky note falls off, which happens, then it's important for me to be able to look at my knitting. So reading your knitting, always a good skill in all knitting.
Yeah, and reading your knitting doesn't have like you don't necessarily have to be able to like read rows down. All you really need to do to check your position in a chart is like count how many purl stitches are between your knit stitches on your left needle after you finished a row, and then compare to your chart. And the next row after that is the one you're on. You don't have to really be able to follow the path of things down your knitting.
Yep. So lots of different ways. It's like,
Yeah.
honestly, it's like whatever works for you. Because I do know that I thought it was you, Andy, who had a app on your phone that you could make notes on the pattern.
I do. I mean, I just use Adobe Acrobat on
Oh,
my
okay.
phone,
I
and
thought
then
so.
I put notes on it. But
Yeah.
I don't. I memorize charts. I don't really look
Yeah.
at that.
Well, also you can use just, plain old pen and paper and do hash marks. I've done that before too. If I just live like, here I did one repeat of this chart and just hash marks. But whatever works for you.
Jen is probably who you're thinking of, our coworker
Probably.
Jen, who I sit next to in the office. She has an app that I think you can load charts in to put them like side by side so that you can see relative to them. I will ask her what that app is called.
Okay, that is what I'm thinking of. If we figure it out, we'll put it in the notes.
All right, our next question is any tips for vertical gauge in patterns?
Well, it depends. I mean, most of the time it depends on the pattern, but sometimes you don't have to worry about it. If you're just going by measurements. But if you're really not getting the gauge, the vertical gauge, but you're getting the row gauge, there's some little tips and tricks you can do, different materials or shapes like Foursquare.
Like maybe if you're using metal, try wood, or if you're
Yeah.
using wood, try metal, that kind of thing.
Another tip I've heard is to use, I haven't actually had to do this, but you can actually, if you're using interchangeable needles, use a different size for, like, if it's like, I know this is mainly on for like a stocking knit pattern, but if your pearls are tighter or looser than your knit stitches, you can put a different needle size on that. Um, and use 2 different needle sizes on your interchangeable cord. That has helped a lot of people. I personally haven't used it, but I
That
know
trick
that
only works if you're knitting flat, though. If your pattern combines knitting flat with knitting in the round, that's
Yeah.
not going to help you out. But you can use it to like get a more even fabric if your purl rows are different than your knit rows. But you can also intentionally make either your knit rows or your purl rows slightly different to change the average for your vertical gauge. If you want to adjust the vertical gauge like that, it will make a slightly less even looking fabric. But like if it's just minute, no one's gonna notice.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it'll all block out.
Yeah.
Speaking of all blocking out, if your pattern involves like cable and stockinette, like within the same row, like a panel, and you're getting like slightly different row gauge on the cable and the stockinette, like you don't need to change needle size within the row. Like
No.
use
yeah.
one needle size for the stockinette and switch to a different needle size for the cable. Like as long as it's close, use whatever gets you the most right gauge, on the majority of your knitting. And like, block your gauge swatch, make sure it looks good. It's probably going to block out fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't stress too much.
All right. So cable sweaters with superwash, yes or no?
Yes.
Sure.
I think same as like so many other issues is make a nice big gauge swatch and block it out. Wash it how you're going to be washing your sweater, however that, whether it's in the machine or by hand, like however you're going to be handling your sweater, and see if it looks good. And it might not. You might learn the answer is like, oh no, not for this particular pattern. But it might be great.
Yeah, and you'll want to make sure if you are using superwash and it's one that can go in the dryer, that you are actually drying your gauge swatch in the dryer and not just laying it flat.
Well, if you're going to be
If you
drying
plan to dry
If you plan on
sweater
drying your
in
sweater.
the dryer.
Like I'm thinking if it's like for a kiddo, or a new mom, like for kid sweaters, like you will definitely want to make sure that your gauge swatch is going to be exactly how the finished project is going to be cared for.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, because superwash can block out very differently if you dry it flat versus drying it in the dryer.
mhm,
So for me, like I pretty much air dry, dry flat all of my sweaters,
same.
regardless of whether they're superwash or not, which means that they do block out like a bit bigger usually than they are in the needle.
Mhm.
But if I put them in the dryer, they'd probably block out a bit smaller than they are in the needles. So a big difference.
And if you're listening to this and not understanding why this might be something someone is wondering about or like what to be looking for on your gauge swatch, it's just that superwash yarn can be less lofty. So you'll get a flatter cable instead of like a bouncy, squishy cable. And it tends to have more drape. So you won't get sort of that firm structure that you would with a untreated wool cable. But it really varies depending on like how the yarn is spun, what superwash process it used. So that's why the answer is make a swatch, find out. And like some people actually like the flatter, drapier cables you get with like a less tightly spun, less lofty superwash. So you might like it even if it is kind of what we're talking about.
Basically, the takeaway from this conversation is make a gauge swatch, which I realize, and wash it and dry it.
Because the thing, especially with this type of project with a cable sweater, like it's a lot more than just a gauge swatch. It's like an example of what your sweater is going to look and feel like swatch.
Yeah.
So you want to look at it, feel it, think about how it's going to hang on your body. Like it's much more than just gauge. It's like, is this good? Is this what I want?
Our next question is, how do you get the right fit and size when knitting a sweater without worrying the whole time it will still fit when you are done? Swatching. It's swatching.
One thing I also kind of mentioned is to make sure like you can check your gauge while you're knitting. Just kind of if you're because your tension could change depending on when and where you're knitting. Or like if you have a sweater in your that you were started like 3 years ago, you might knit differently now. So just making sure you're checking that you're not going too loose or too tight. So
Yeah, and that's a good argument for taking your pre-blocked gauge from your swatches. So then you have a point of reference to your fresh on your needle knitting,
mhm.
because your block gauge is what your knitting is going to
Right.
end up being,
Mm.
but your pre-block gauge is what's on your needles. And if
Yeah.
it changes between the two, then you don't have a very good reference to know.
That's
Yeah,
true.
that's
Unless
a
you write that
super
down.
good tip because that way if you're feeling like, "Oh, this seems too big or this seems too small," like, I'm not sure, like, you can always measure your gauge on the needle and check that against your pre-block gauge and have peace of mind and be like, "Nope, that's how it should be."
Yeah.
Okay, summarizing, do a gauge swatch for all of these answers.
Measure it
Do a
before
gauge
you wash
swatch,
it.
measure it, then wash it,
So
and then dry it, and then measure it again.
And, beyond the gauge swatch, like, the worrying about fit while it's on the needles, it really depends on the construction, I think,
Mhm.
of the sweater. You know, some sweaters you can kinda try on as you go and see
Yeah.
if they seem right, and then some sweaters there's not really any way to do that, so there's not much answer beyond gauge swatching, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and a reminder, even if it looks small on the needles, I mean, if you did a proper gauge swatch, you gotta remember, like, blocking, as I said, is magic. So,
Mhm.
especially with wool, if you're using wool or alpaca or animal fibers, it's gonna be magic. So,
It's also worth remembering that generally, if you're knitting with circular needles, you're going to be using a smaller circumference needle than your project, so everything's smushed. Like
yeah.
it's smushed up. So
Yeah.
it's hard to judge while it's still on those needles.
Right, and then this one kinda relates to the last one. Besides gauge swatches, what is the best way to get your sizing correct for a sweater?
Well, gauge is most important. But they apparently anticipated we were gonna say gauge swatches the entire time. Mine is keeping ease in mind. Um, like for instance, our patterns, our produced patterns, from knitpicks, we always give the final measurement of the sweater. But if a sweater is to be worn with ease, you're gonna make sure you're doing that. If you have a 36 chest and the pattern is written with 4 inches of ease, you're gonna make sure you're following the finished project for a 40-inch chest sweater.
Or,
So
like, as close as you can
as
get
close
to
as
it.
you can get.
And if you're, like, halfway between, then you can decide for yourself, do you wanna have less ease than the pattern intended, or do you want more ease than the pattern intended? You know, by a couple inches if you have to go up and down based on what sizes are offered. Do you like a little looser or do you like a little less loose?
Yeah, so you're gonna wanna make sure you're checking those finished measurements, and if you have a pattern that doesn't have finished measurements as the sizes to knit, you'll wanna check if it's one of our patterns, definitely, but if it's another person's pattern, you'll wanna check to make sure that the schematic and the final numbers are there. So, um, and just kinda read the notes if it's an oversized sweater or if it's a fitted sweater that's supposed to be right on your chest size, or if it's supposed to be a little bit tighter, you'll wanna go with negative ease, and you'll just wanna pick the pattern or pick the size that works best for you and the pattern.
Um, and when you're picking a size, I would suggest not just looking at the chest measurement. That's the one that gets prioritized in knitting. But if you are knitting either like a satin sleeve sweater, you want to check the shoulder measurement, because for a satin sleeve sweater to look like it fits, that's actually the most important measurement. You can fudge and increase the bust, but if your shoulders don't fit, the whole sweater is going to look like it doesn't fit. Um, People really prioritize the chest circumference, but there are other measurements that are important. The other one to look at is armhole depth, because like you can have an intentionally deep armhole, drop shoulders and circular yokes often have deep armholes for movement and for the aesthetic, but too deep of an armhole, especially on like raglans, can look a little bunchy and messy. So you want to make sure like the measurement makes sense for your body. instead of just looking at one measurement and calling it good. And you can blend sizes. Like you can start with one size and increase up or down to another size. If like the shoulders look the right size, but maybe you need a bigger chest, you can cast on more stitches when you get to the underarms and things like that. So don't feel locked into following one size exactly as it's written.
Yeah. For instance, I always I look at the length of the sweater because I have a long torso, so I always know I need to. It's more for sewing patterns that I've noticed, but on knitting patterns too, I usually add an inch or two to the length of the sweater depending on what it is, and especially to the arms, I always add length to it because I know that I have very long arms. I prefer my sweaters not to be bracelet or 3/4 length. I would like it to be actual long sleeve sweater.
Yeah. A mod I find myself doing a lot when knitting other people's patterns is like raising up the armhole because they hit me at a weird point on my chest if they're too deep and it looks really sloppy and weird and like my chest is trying to escape out the side.
It's always good to see like what if it's a pattern that's been around for a while too, is to look at what other people have done. I like using Ravelry or Instagram for that to look it up. You can look at what other people have done and what other modifications they've done. That's always really helpful too. Next one. Oh, this is one we're going to fight about. Do you need
Have our own opinions about don't fight.
Do you need special cable needles? So I'm not sure what you mean by what this question is about special cable needles, but cable needles come in a variety of styles. And you just need to find the one that works for you. Or maybe if you're like my friend Lee, cable needles don't work for you and you just want to do it without a needle. So,
yeah. And we are talking about cable needles, different from knitting needles.
Yeah.
I personally prefer not to use cable needles at all, but that's because I've kind of gotten used to that over the years. That's something you might want to try and see if you like it. If I do use a cable needle, I prefer the kind that are bendy, that have either like a U shape or like straight with like a V in the middle, because those hang down and like don't get in my way because usually if I am using cable needles, it's because I'm knitting like very complex or very wide cables that are harder to knit without a cable needle. So if I'm knitting like complex cables or wide cables, I want my cable needle to hang out of the way and not get in the way of my other stitches. So that's my personal preference.
I don't like to cable with a cable needle if I can avoid it, but like multi-step cables where you have to like hold some in front, knit some, then move that to the back and knit some, like it gets too complicated for me. But you really don't need special cable needles because I'm usually discovering that the cable's too complicated when I'm all cozy on the couch. And you can use so many straight things as a cable needle. A darning needle works pretty great as a cable needle because like the sort of enlarged end helps keep your stitches from slipping off the back. Paper clip works. I don't actually own any real cable needles. So I've done things like used IC tip, like a shorty that doesn't have a cable, like a IC cable attached to it. It's just the needle tip. And you can use the connector to like slip stitches on and slip stitches off. And like, I've also used a DPN that's broken in half that I've sanded down.
Sorry, I just didn't. I don't think I remember that one.
Definitely nothing special. You don't. Yeah. You just need something straight that'll hold your needles.
I use DPNs, double pointed needle, pretty exclusively. I don't really like the ones with the ridge. And I feel like especially when I'm cabling a lot, I have cabled without a needle. I just prefer to have the cable. I don't know why. It just makes me feel better. I don't know. But so I use usually a short DPN, but if I'm curled up on the couch and can't reach one, I will use a longer DPN because usually I have a couple sitting on my table. So
you can even use a non-ergonomic crochet hook in a finer gauge than your current project. That's another one I've used. I like you name a like narrow straight thing, and I have probably used it as a cable needle at some point.
So yes, you don't need special cable needles, but if you do want to use cable needles, like find the one that works for you. So
Mhm.
Just check. We've got bunch of different ones on the site. And as you can tell from just the three of us, we all have definitely different preferences. So
Yeah. And I think if you do prefer to use a cable needle and you don't want to go about a whole project with, primarily not using a cable needle, if you're going to use one throughout an entire project, it will make the project more pleasant to use the kind that you prefer instead of just whatever DPNs you happen to be sitting around.
Yes.
Like if you prefer the U-shaped or if you prefer the ridged kind, or it'll make the project more enjoyable to use what you like.
Absolutely. That brings us to our next question, which is what notions and accessories should we have before starting our first cable knitting project?
well, cable
So
needles or not.
Yeah, I think trying like your first cable project is a good time to try a couple different kinds of cable needles and see what you like.
A ton of
Definitely
stitch markers.
stitch
Yes.
markers.
Stitch
Yeah,
markers,
stitch
lots and
markers.
lots of stitch markers. I love marking like anytime, like if it's multiple cables, but like if it's like several cables across, I always put stitch markers. I use different colored ones or different styles just to mark. Like with Axiom, even I did because I converted it to in the round on the body. I put a different stitch marker for the beginning of the round, a different stitch marker for the start of the cable, and like then within the cable and at the end of the cable. So stitch markers.
And
love them.
something I would do for stitch markers before I worked at knitpicks and had an abundance of all different kinds of stitch markers in my house now, I would make stitch markers from loops of yarn, just tied in knots, tied into loops. So that way I could control the colors. I could know that I have, blue for this and red for this and pink for or whatever. And I could choose yarn to make color coded markers.
Yeah, an abundance of stitch markers is definitely I'm pretty like loosey goosey with my tools, as I have revealed, and like I don't buy a lot of tools, but like stitch markers are the one thing where I'm like, no, you need to use those sometimes. It makes life so much easier.
Yeah, and in fact, when I do an order, if I'm ordering some yarn for a new project, I usually end up throwing in like, a $5 pack of stitch markers because I lose them all the time, or my cat runs off with them, or they fall into the couch and never to be found again. Other suggestions, row counters is what I'm like using. Like I said, I use quite a few of them.
Chart keeper is
Chart
something you
keeper.
might want to consider if you have a printed out pattern.
A good project bag is one of my suggestions because I don't really use endpoints for my knitting needles because I find putting them in the project bag keeps my knitting clean and also keeps stitches from slipping off because it's not getting wiggled around. Picking up drop stitches from a cable row is a nightmare. So project bag and maybe point protectors if you're really nervous.
Yeah,
definitely. Some way to keep it tidy.
Yeah.
Especially if you have animals, you might get a hold of it. Whatever.
Yes.
Cool. Well, I think we went over a lot of good points. Your most important takeaway, gauge swatch. Wash your gauge swatch. And just like go for it. I think the thing about knitting something that you really enjoy is key because, cables are a bit more tedious. They take a bit longer. And if you're like, this one is supposed to be easy, so it's the one I'm going to start with, even though I'm not really into it, like you're not going to want to devote the time into making it, if you don't love it. So knit something you love.
That's good for any project.
Yeah,
so
in general.
Well, cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, and leave your favorite cable patterns in the comments. I think I would love to see them. I am a cable fanatic. So, and thanks, Andy, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Andy.
This podcast was originally created by Kelly Petkin.
It is produced and hosted by me, Lee Meredith, and Stacey Winkelblack.
Produced by Andy Satterland with additional production and editing by Chase Ryan.
We recorded this episode in the Pacific Northwest, where we hope you are planning your next cable knitting project.
From everyone here at KnitPicks, thank you for joining us.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the individual participants. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions or views of Crafts Group LLC or Premier Needle Arts.
All the yarn, tools, and patterns mentioned in this episode, along with all the inspiration a knit could need, can be found on our website at knitpicks.com.
If you'd like to be on our podcast, leave us a voicemail. We'll be checking it regularly and using your calls in later episodes. To leave a voicemail, call 360-334-4847 and record your message. You can also record a voice memo on your phone and email us that audio file at podcast@knitpicks.com.
Like and follow us on your favorite social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube at knitpicks.
Rate and review us wherever you listen to this podcast.
Until next time, happy crafting.